Thanks, Brandon. So I first want to start out by introducing myself. I'm Rob. I work at a company called Salt Lending. And this talk was more focused on the user experience around Bitcoin. And it actually got started through a debate, really, about what the killer app for Bitcoin actually is. And so, I want to apologize for anybody who's here to discover what the killer app is, because it's already been invented. It's called Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is the killer app in itself. And so if you'll stick around for a little bit longer, I'll tell you why that is and why I think we need to spend a little bit more time on moving up in our needs for how to increase adoption for Bitcoin. So if we take a look at, basically, is anybody familiar with the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, of human needs, of sort of how that works? So the idea is that at the bottom you have basically a foundation of, like what you expect, how you can have predictability in an environment. And then as you move up, you have these more subjective characteristics. So, if we use this same framework to talk about Bitcoin, we know that it's functional, it's reliable, it's usable, because we have 10 years of data, right? We have 10 years of people using it, a little bit more now at this point, right? We're all here because Bitcoin exists, and we want to increase that adoption. So just, talking about a couple of more points about why Bitcoin itself is the killer app. So, there's irreversible transactions, it has the security, it's decentralized, and really it has the 10 years of growth, and really the best thing about Bitcoin at this point is that it is what you bring to it, right? So for some people it's a middle finger to the man, for some people it's the ability to stick it to the government, whatever it is that you're bringing to this application. So I want to talk a little bit more about how we can make that, so let me go back for a second, a little bit more about how we can make sure that these are objectively things that we can rely on, that Bitcoin is functional, Bitcoin is reliable, and Bitcoin is usable. And actually, this is the talk that was just prior to mine was RSK. And RSK chose to look at all the all the blockchain networks that are out there in the world that exist today, and they chose to build their application or their sidechain on top of Bitcoin because of the properties that are up here. And so I want to take a minute to highlight two other projects really quickly that are doing the same thing. So Blockstack is basically a project that's trying to recreate the internet. And so if you think about what that requires, it requires a lot of effort. It requires basically taking a look at every single blockchain that exists and saying, well, none of those are going to work for recreating the internet. We need to use Bitcoin because Bitcoin is decentralized, it's immutable, and it is secure in a way that we think we can build on top of it. And then I think one more project that's really important that's just came up recently is Microsoft's Ion. And essentially, it's Bitcoin, but for identity, right? So if you think about managing your own identity on the internet, right now it's scattered across the place, right? Like you give your social security number to everyone, you give your passwords management to someone else, you give all this sort of secure information to all these other parties. And so Microsoft is working on basically a decentralized identifier that will allow you to have an identity on the internet. And so the reason that's important is because a company like Microsoft decided not to build their own blockchain just like everyone else. They decided not to bite off more than they could chew at this point. And they looked at Bitcoin and they said, this is the network that we're going to use because it has all these properties that fit what we're trying to create. So now that we have all that out of the way, Bitcoin's really great, right? We all know that it's really great. Again, we're here for that reason. So why isn't everyone using Bitcoin, right? And it comes down to two letters. And since I wasn't really sure if this was like an actual interactive stage or it was just called that, does anybody have a guess what those two letters might be? Two letters. Nobody? I didn't practice on anyone that I work with, so they shouldn't know either. Nobody? All right. UX, right? It's the user experience. And again, doing research about the killer app on top of Bitcoin, it was a heated, at some points it's a heated debate because it's like, well, it needs to be usable and functional, but it also needs to be, we need to have a wider adoption, right? We want people that, like your grandmother and your mom, we basically just want our parents to be able to use Bitcoin, right? But right now, that's maybe not as approachable as it could be. And so, you can just see anywhere, basically, that this is all it seems like people are talking about. The user experience, the user experience, the user experience. I don't know how it works. Well, that's okay. Like, people don't have to understand how something works fully, but it has to be approachable in a way that they can understand it. And, these articles are written with good reason. If you look at some of the early user experiences around Bitcoin and networks and mining and even just buying Bitcoin, right? The experience isn't great. Imagine introducing the concept of a wallet recovery seed. You need to write down these 12 words, keep them somewhere safe, maybe put them in a safe, but maybe you need to split them in half and send some here and send some there. If you want to buy Bitcoin, you kind of got to go through this sort of older Coinbase experience. Imagine using Mt. Gox and then finding out that it doesn't exist anymore or that your Bitcoins have been stolen, right? So if the user experience is not intuitive and doesn't provide you with sort of the things that you need, you're not going to use it over time, and you're not going to have sort of the wider adoption. So I think it's okay at this point that we're at that point where the user experiences are like that, because if you look at the innovators and early adopters phase of this sort of innovation adoption curve of this new technology, we're talking about fundamentally recreating something that is identity, that is security, that is money. And so we're really, really far. I would say maybe we're in the line between innovators and early adopters. Maybe we're in the early adopters phase. But it's okay, it's sufficient for the technology to be terminal-based, for it to be something that is just usable at this point. But I think we really need to take a step and start to look at how we can create experiences around improving this. And so if we go back to this hierarchy of needs from a user experience standpoint, we've sort of established that the usability, reliability, and functionality is there. And so as you move from these objective characteristics of any kind of user experience, you kind of move into these subjective characteristics. And that's really the experiences that set any application apart from others, right? So if you're talking about the usability of something over time or the wider adoption, you need to kind of keep two things in mind. And really, the role of design at this point and UX and technology is really to simplify the technology so that it is basically one of two things. It's either beautiful or it's invisible. And so what I mean by that specifically is if it's beautiful, people can't wait to use it. They're ready to sign up for it. You can't stop people from signing up for your application. Everybody wants to use it just because it's so great to interact with. It's so beautiful. Things like Google's material design come to mind, or Apple's first iPhone, or the progression of the iPhone over time come to mind. And then if you think about sort of the flip side of that, taking things like seed mnemonic phrases and things that are complex and making them invisible where they need to be so that users don't have to have all this extra information that maybe isn't important to them. So it's really more about figuring out how you can serve those needs to users where they want to know that stuff and hiding the things that they don't need to know about. And so I want to take a second to go through a couple of examples, and regardless of your opinion, I think that Coinbase has done a really good job at growing and iterating on an experience to make Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies approachable, easy to use, easy to understand. I mean, at this point, you're at a Christmas party, you're at Thanksgiving, and you see, your parents and older people just refreshing Coinbase to see the price, right? So maybe they don't understand all the mechanics of it or how it works, but Coinbase has done a lot to make it approachable. And I would really, I hope this gets shared out, but these links about the things that Coinbase is doing outside of just the actual Coinbase application are tremendous for the community. Things like the Coinbase wallet, their custody solution, their staking mechanisms that they're introducing to the world. I think they're making these technologies a lot more approachable in a way that people will have a much wider adoption and people will be able to understand them and digest them. I want to take a second to talk about different applications and how they're surfacing different user experiences. So has anybody ever bought crypto in Robinhood before? Anybody bought Bitcoin or any of that? Have you tried to transfer it out of Robinhood? Yeah, right, thumbs down. So again, it's all about what you choose to make beautiful and what you choose to make invisible. So some people might say, okay, that's okay that I don't need to transfer it out. I'm just going to leave it with Robinhood. But for some other people, that may not be sufficient. And so a Robinhood is a really good introduction to Bitcoin. I'm glad that they made this product, that it exists in the world, but it's for a specific community of people. And I think as you kind of move up the chain of needs, you start to understand that maybe something like Exodus. Has anybody ever used Exodus desktop client before? So they basically just spent, I think 2+ years working on their mobile version of that because they wanted to perfect it. They wanted to create a user experience that was both beautiful, intuitive, and invisible in the right ways to their users. And so they spent a lot of time kind of creating this mobile experience that was really beautiful. And then I think another really good example, if you haven't ever downloaded or tried out Samurai Wallet, I would highly encourage you to just check it out. It's got all of the sort of advanced user features built into it, but they surface them in a way that's really understandable. So things like using a Tor client to be able to send transactions to hide your IP address, the ability to make fast transactions or slow transactions. You don't care that much, right? So imagine someone opening up Robinhood, buying Bitcoin, and then going to this. right? It's something that has to be introduced to them in the right way so that people can really grasp the concept and understand how that works. Even something as new as Lightning Network at this point still has people creating user experiences that are on top of it. And the person who created this, actually their goal was to make a user-friendly UI, right? That was their sort of first presupposed idea was, well, Lightning Network is great, but how do we make that approachable? How do we make that usable? How can we create an application on top of that that people feel comfortable using and that they can understand so that, again, so that we have a wider adoption of Lightning Network? And this application is relatively new. I had the chance to use it at Consensus to buy something at a store. And essentially what it allows you to do, again, it hides the things that need to be hidden and it shows the things that need to be shown, right? So this is a really, for all intents and purposes, is a really beautiful user experience. You can deposit crypto really easily, but you can spend it at any of these stores. There's 30,000 stores that accept it. So that's the target audience there is people that actually want to spend their crypto. But the merchants, like Barnes & Noble, Baskin Robbins, all these places didn't have to do anything. They didn't have to change anything that they're doing because there's this invisible component to how this works. Where when you go to the store, all you do is you have a QR code and you purchase something and you use crypto from you, and for them, they got dollars that they needed. So the process of that conversion is all hidden underneath the hood, and it doesn't really matter because you got to do the thing that you wanted to do at the end of the day. And regardless of the name, this is a decent app, and I think will create some wider adoption. At this point, I would be remiss not to mention Salt, again, the company that I work for. We have created a user experience that I think, and this is a big shout out to everyone who's here and everyone who's back in Denver. We spend a lot of time holistically thinking about what our users want to do, how we can basically allow them to unlock the value of their crypto and surface the information to them at the right time. We can give them notifications. We can address all their concerns about someone else holding their private keys or someone else sending your crypto to our platform. And so it's been a really iterative process. If you look back at what we had even 6 months ago, and then you look back another 12 months beyond that, it's almost unrecognizable. And so it is really an iterative process that we go through to create these user experiences that make people feel really comfortable using our applications. And so I'll leave you with one final thought. Basically, it's this concept that the CEO of Shopify uses to really sort of conceptualize how you can create a user experience that's valuable to your users, or you can start to think like a user. And it's basically this. The analogy that he uses is, all right, I own an e-commerce store, I sell snowboards, so I have a user that thinks, oh, I want to buy a snowboard, and then they have a snowboard right there in their hands. So how can you take that same idea, same concept, and apply it to what you're trying to do? And I think the idea is that you can sort of imagine the most optimal user experience that you want to create for your users, whether it's privacy, security, usability, whatever it is that you're trying to achieve from a user standpoint, and you sort of ingrain those concepts in your products and work backwards from that. So when you're thinking about things that are as complicated as again, mnemonic phrases, security, backups, any kind of process that you find difficult or that you have to personally do a lot of research on before you can even implement it, start to think about how you can take that experience and either make it beautiful, you can make it invisible, or both. That's it. Thank you. I think 1 minute.
Fantastic.
So.
And we've got time for just a couple questions. I
Sure.
see you right there in the front. I'm coming to you.
How much do you think that high fees, make the usability worse?
Sorry?
How much do you think that fees influence the usability? Do you think on-chain fees? I mean, high fees?
Yeah, I think at first you don't even know what fees are, right? So if you go to Robinhood, you buy Bitcoin, you're like, okay, great, I own Bitcoin. But then this is actually a discussion I was having earlier. You can buy Bitcoin in the Cash App for 1% fee. You can buy Bitcoin in Coinbase for a certain fee. So I think it kind of goes back to what kind of experience are you trying to create? Is it clear that Coinbase is higher fees? Do you want to be transparent about that, or do you want to hide that? And I think more than anything, it probably says a lot about your sort of moral compass as a company or a project about how you surface those.
I'm talking about the on-chain fees.
Right, yeah, on-chain. Oh, on-chain fees.
Minor fees.
Minor fees. That's a great question. We talk about that a lot. And our solution right now, for example, is to have, when people deposit, onto our platform, we suggest they have a minimum amount of gas, for example, for ETH, to be able to send any ERC20s out of the platform. Ultimately, what we're leaning towards is actually hiding all of that and just paying the fees ourselves. It's sort of a cost of doing business. Again, we want the adoption, and so we're willing to eat the cost of some of the fees at this point for sure, especially with Bitcoin, especially with Bitcoin. Yeah.
Any more questions? Got one right here.
Oh.
What do you think is the number one most difficult UX challenge in Bitcoin right now?
Geographically distributed multi-signature signing. So the idea is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think I'm looking at people in the back here. Essentially, you have 4 people who live in different parts of the world, and they need to sign it. All 4 of those people need to sign a transaction, or 3 of 4 need to sign a transaction. How do you create a user experience that, number one, lets those people know that they're being waited on to provide their private key as a signature, and how do you calculate the fees to make sure that that transaction will get mined in a reasonable amount of time? Because if you think about, like, all right, if I sign it first and it gets sent to the other people and we're waiting on their private keys to sign that message or that transaction, the fees could go up, so it could not get mined. The fees could go down, you could overpay, depending on how much time there is. So I think, and that's something that we're working on. We're trying to figure out how we can effectively do that, and it's a pretty big challenge, especially when you're not in the same. If you're in the same location, it's easy, right? You're like, hey, everybody come, we'll sign. Not literally sign, but provide your key. But if you're geographically distributed somewhere in the globe, how can you make that work effectively?